Ethan Carter lived in a world of shimmering glass towers and high-stakes boardrooms. At just 32, he had built an empire of upscale restaurants across the city, each boasting impeccable service and Michelin-starred menus. Yet as he leaned back in his leather chair, gazing out from his penthouse office at the glittering skyline, Ethan felt an ache he couldn't name. The accolades, the luxurious lifestyle, the endless stream of gala invitations. None of it filled the quiet void that gnawed at him late at night. His tailored suits and luxury cars were a shield, one that left him untouchable, but also strangely invisible to anyone who might see past the facade. In the quiet working-class neighborhood of Santa Clara, Sophie Delgado was starting her day at the crack of dawn. Her tiny apartment was a far cry from Ethan's penthouse, but it was warm, cluttered with books and art supplies, and alive with the scent of bread rising in the kitchen. At 25, Sophie juggled multiple jobs. Early mornings as a baker at the local cafe, afternoons as a part-time art teacher, and evenings caring for her younger siblings while her father worked night shifts. Life was an unrelenting cycle of responsibilities, but Sophie carried it all with a smile that seemed to light up any room she walked into. Unlike Ethan, Sophie didn't dream of opulence. She found joy in small acts of kindness. A loaf of bread left on a neighbor's doorstep, a sketch given to a child who admired her work, a few dollars slipped into the hands of the elderly man who sat by the park gate each morning. Her world was simple, but her heart was vast, her generosity as boundless as her belief that kindness, no matter how small, could change the world. What Sophie didn't know, as she tied on her apron and prepared for another long day, was that her kindness had not gone unnoticed. From the polished windows of the Sinclair Group's headquarters, Ethan had watched her one morning, pausing to share her breakfast with a homeless man in the park. There was something about the way she moved, the sincerity in her actions, that pulled at him. She was everything his world was not: real, unpretentious, and profoundly human. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Ethan first noticed her. From the expansive window of his corner office, he often looked out over the bustling city, scanning the streets and parks below for a fleeting sense of connection to the world beyond his empire. That day, his gaze fell on a small park nestled between rows of brick buildings, a haven of green amidst the chaos of urban life. There, by a weathered bench, was Sophie. She stood out, not because of her appearance, but because of her actions. Clad in a simple baker's uniform, her apron slightly dusted with flour, she crouched down beside an elderly man whose clothes were threadbare and mismatched. His face was worn by years on the street, his hands trembling as he clutched a battered paper cup. Ethan watched, intrigued, as Sophie pulled a small package from her messenger bag. She unwrapped it carefully, a piece of freshly baked bread, golden and inviting. With a smile that seemed to carry the warmth of the morning sun, she handed it to the man, speaking words Ethan couldn't hear but could somehow feel. Her expression was kind, her gestures genuine, devoid of pity or pretense. The man hesitated at first, his pride perhaps resisting the offering, but Sophie's smile didn't waver. She sat beside him, breaking off a piece of the bread herself, as if to share not just the food but the moment. Slowly, the man accepted, and they began to talk. Ethan felt a strange stirring in his chest as he watched. He had seen countless acts of charity before, often performed with fanfare at the galas he attended. But this was different. It was quiet, real, and unspoken, a connection born of kindness. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself wanting to know more, not about the man on the bench, but about the woman who had stopped to share her morning with him. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on the park below. The image of the young woman, her quiet kindness, her unassuming presence, lingered in his mind like the faint scent of freshly baked bread. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, though in truth, he hadn't met her at all. He didn't even know her name. But something about her compelled him. It wasn't just her generosity, it was the ease with which she gave, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He turned away from the window, the polished, minimalist luxury of his office suddenly feeling cold and distant. For years, he had been surrounded by people who said all the right things, laughed at all the right moments, but whose motives were always transparent: wealth, power, influence. This woman, however, didn't seem to care about any of that. Her world was smaller, simpler, and yet somehow richer than his own. The thought began as a whisper, a fleeting notion, but it grew louder and more insistent with every passing moment. What if he stepped out of his world and into hers? What if he left behind the suits, the titles, the prestige, and saw life through her eyes? Could he understand what drove her kindness, her quiet courage? Could he find the connection he'd been missing? Ethan stood and crossed the room, his reflection staring back at him from the floor to ceiling glass. He didn't recognize himself anymore. "Cancel my meetings for the next few weeks," he instructed his assistant through the intercom. "And find me some clothes. Nothing new. Something old, worn. Make sure they look real." His assistant paused. "Are you planning some sort of disguise?" Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile. Something like that. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of excitement. He was about to step into a world far removed from his own, and she was the reason why. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and the hum of distant city traffic. Ethan sat on a worn wooden bench in the park, hunched against the chill. His reflection in the shop window earlier had startled him. Gone was the polished image of a millionaire. His normally sleek hair was messy, his face unshaven. He wore a tattered hoodie that hung loosely over an old flannel shirt, and his jeans were frayed at the cuffs. His designer watch and polished shoes were replaced by nothing more than a scuffed pair of sneakers. He shifted uncomfortably, pulling the hoodie tighter around himself. The fabric scratched against his skin, foreign and rough compared to his usual cashmere and silk. The bench was harder than he expected, the chill seeping into his legs. It was the first time in years he felt invisible, a ghost among the joggers, dog walkers, and office workers bustling by without a second glance. Ethan scanned the paths crisscrossing the park, wondering if she would come. A part of him felt ridiculous. What if she didn't show? What if she didn't notice him? What if, worse, she did notice, but walked right past? He shook the thoughts from his head. He wasn't here to be noticed. He was here to understand. At exactly 7:15, he spotted her. She walked briskly, her copper-toned hair catching the light as it spilled over her shoulders. She wore the same baker's uniform he'd seen before, a messenger bag slung across her chest, and in her hand, a small brown paper bag. Ethan's heart raced as she drew closer. He lowered his gaze, hunching forward, trying to blend into the background. As her footsteps approached, he felt his breath catch. Would she stop? Would she see him? Ethan kept his head down as Sophie's footsteps approached, his pulse quickening with every second. He could feel her presence before he saw her, a warm energy that seemed to cut through the crisp morning air. He dared a glance upward, just as her shoes stopped in front of him. "Hi," she said gently, her voice soft but steady. "Would you like something to eat?" Ethan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Up close, her face was even more striking, not because of any glamorous beauty, but because of the warmth and sincerity radiating from her eyes. He hesitated, remembering his role. "I don't want to trouble you," he mumbled, pitching his voice lower and rougher than usual. "It's no trouble at all," Sophie said, crouching down to his level. She opened the brown paper bag she'd been carrying, revealing a neatly wrapped sandwich. "I always bring an extra, just in case." Ethan's throat tightened. The way she said it, like it was the most normal thing in the world, unnerved him. Slowly, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers as he took the sandwich. "Thank you," he said, genuinely. Sophie smiled and sat down beside him, leaving a comfortable space between them. "Do you come here often?" she asked, breaking off a piece of her own breakfast. "I don't think I've seen you before." Ethan glanced at her, unsure of how much to reveal. "Not really," he lied. "Just passing through." She nodded, as if understanding. "It's a nice park, quiet, good place to catch your breath." Her eyes flickered over him briefly, not in judgment, but in quiet observation. "Are you doing okay?" The question caught him off guard. He didn't answer right away, unsure of how to respond. Finally, he said, "I've been better." Sophie didn't press, her gaze softening. "There's a shelter a few blocks away," she said after a moment. "They open at noon. You can get a hot meal, maybe some warm clothes." Ethan nodded, touched by her concern. "Thanks," he murmured, though he had no intention of going. As they sat in silence for a moment, Sophie broke off another piece of her sandwich and handed it to him. "Sometimes it helps to start with breakfast," she said with a small smile. "Gets you through the day." Ethan looked at her, the weight of her kindness settling in his chest. He nodded again, unsure of what to say, and they ate together in quiet companionship. As Sophie rose to leave, Ethan watched her carefully pack up the remnants of her breakfast and sling her messenger bag over her shoulder. She turned to him with another smile, this one softer, as though it carried an unspoken wish for his well-being. "Take care," she said, her voice full of genuine warmth. "And don't forget about the shelter. They're good people." Ethan nodded, murmuring a quiet thank you as she walked away, her steps purposeful yet unhurried. Her figure grew smaller with each step, but the impact of her presence lingered, as if the space she'd occupied still held her warmth. He leaned back against the bench, the sandwich in his hand feeling heavier than it should. The bread was simple, the kind he hadn't eaten in years, but its taste was oddly comforting. It wasn't just the food, it was the act itself. She had offered him something without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. It was an effortless, instinctive kindness, something Ethan realized he had rarely encountered, even in his carefully curated social circles. Most people in his life sought to impress or flatter, their generosity always transactional, always calculated. Sophie, in contrast, had been real. She hadn't asked for his name, his story, or any explanation of why he was there. She had simply seen someone in need and acted. That kind of openness, that willingness to give without judgment, was foreign to him. Ethan found himself marveling at the simplicity of her gesture. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it had moved him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He wanted to know more about her, what drove her, how she saw the world, and why she carried herself with such quiet strength. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir within him, something beyond the emptiness that had defined his life of luxury. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a pull, a need to understand the light he had glimpsed in her. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the park earlier than usual, once again donning his tattered hoodie and scuffed sneakers. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint promise of a bright day ahead. He sat on the same bench, his eyes scanning the pathways for Sophie. At exactly 7:15, she appeared. Her copper-toned hair caught the sunlight, and her messenger bag was slung over her shoulder as usual. But today, Ethan noticed something more. Sophie wasn't just walking through the park. She was moving through it with purpose, stopping to interact with people along the way. First, she paused near an elderly woman, struggling to lift a small shopping cart over the curb. The woman's hands trembled as she tried to maneuver the stubborn cart wheels. Sophie didn't hesitate. She crouched down, her hands steady as she lifted the cart onto the pathway with ease. "Thank you, dear," the woman said, her voice tinged with both gratitude and surprise. "It's no trouble," Sophie replied warmly. "Are you heading to the market? I can walk with you if you'd like." The woman smiled, patting Sophie's hand in appreciation. "You're an angel." Ethan watched as Sophie continued her route, her steps never hurried, her demeanor calm yet attentive. Near the edge of the park, she bent down to pick up a few stray wrappers and a crumpled soda can. She tucked the trash into a small bag she carried, her movements efficient yet unassuming. It wasn't a grand gesture, but the simplicity of it struck Ethan. She cared about the little things, the ones most people overlooked. As she approached a different bench, Sophie greeted an older man dressed in layers of mismatched clothing. His beard was unkempt, and his eyes carried the weight of years spent on the streets. Sophie handed him a small brown bag, the same kind she had given Ethan the day before. "Morning, Mr. Allen," she said cheerfully. "I brought you your favorite, a cheese roll from the bakery." The man's face lit up and he chuckled softly. "You spoil me, Sophie." "I just know good company deserves good food," she teased. Ethan felt a strange mix of admiration and awe. Sophie wasn't just kind, she was consistent. She didn't help for recognition or reward, it was simply who she was. Every gesture, every interaction was genuine, leaving a ripple of warmth in her wake. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt humbled, as if he were witnessing a type of wealth he had never truly understood. The following morning, Ethan took his usual spot on the bench, waiting for Sophie. His eyes lingered on the pathways where she always appeared, and when her familiar figure came into view, he felt an inexplicable sense of relief, as if her presence brought order to the chaos he carried within himself. Sophie approached with her usual warm smile, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Good morning," she greeted, handing one to him. "It's a bit chilly today. Thought you might need this." Ethan took the cup, its warmth seeping into his fingers. "Thanks," he said quietly, the simplicity of her gesture stirring something in him once again. Sophie sat down beside him, unwrapping a small sandwich from her bag. She glanced at him, her green eyes curious yet kind. "You don't talk much," she observed gently. "That's okay, but I thought maybe I'd do the talking today. Deal?" Ethan nodded, unsure if he could find the words even if he tried. Sophie began to speak, her voice light but tinged with an undercurrent of weariness. "I work at a bakery a few blocks from here. It's not glamorous, but I like it. There's something comforting about the smell of fresh bread in the morning." She took a bite of her sandwich, then continued. "I also help out at the community center when I can. Art classes, mostly for kids. They're a handful, but it's worth it when you see them light up after finishing a painting. My mom used to paint, you know." Her expression softened, and she gazed into the distance. "She was incredible, but we had to sell most of her supplies when my dad got sick. Still, she always found a way to encourage me to draw, said it was good for the soul." Ethan watched her carefully, noticing how her tone shifted when she spoke of her family. "Your dad?" he asked, his voice hesitant. She nodded, her smile fading slightly. "Yeah, he's been unwell for a while now. It's hard, but we manage. My siblings and I take turns helping him out. He's a tough guy, though. Always has been." Sophie turned back to him, her smile returning, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Anyway, enough about me. What about you? You don't have to say much, but I'd like to know something." Ethan hesitated, his carefully constructed disguise making honesty impossible. "I used to have more," he said, carefully choosing his words, "but things changed." Sophie studied him, her expression open but thoughtful. "Sometimes life throws us curveballs," she said softly. "But you're still here. That counts for something." Ethan said nothing, but her words lingered, wrapping around him like a quiet balm. For the first time, he wondered if he could ever truly tell her the truth. As Sophie walked away that morning, her soft smile lingering in his mind, Ethan remained seated on the bench, staring down at the half-empty coffee cup she'd given him. The warmth had long since seeped away, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it out. Her words echoed in his ears, her kindness so genuine, so undeserved. He glanced at his reflection in the nearby fountain, a man in worn, shabby clothes, pretending to be someone he wasn't. For the first time, the weight of his disguise pressed heavily on his shoulders. Every interaction with Sophie felt like walking a tightrope. Each kind gesture from her, every bit of trust she extended, was met with the lie he lived every time he sat on that bench. The guilt was growing, an ever-present knot tightening in his chest. She was so open, so sincere, and he had met her generosity with deceit. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. His plan had seemed harmless at first, a way to understand her world, to see what made her so extraordinary. But now, Ethan realized how deeply personal it had become. Sophie wasn't just a curiosity or a fleeting distraction. She was someone whose presence illuminated his life in ways he hadn't expected. And yet, his lie loomed between them. Every time she laughed, every time she spoke with such effortless warmth, Ethan felt the sting of his own duplicity. What would she think of him if she knew the truth? Would she still offer him her breakfast, her stories, her friendship? Or would she see him as nothing more than a fraud? Ethan leaned back on the bench, closing his eyes against the morning sun. He had built his life on control, on precision, but this was a mess he couldn't untangle. He didn't just want to keep Sophie in his life. He wanted to deserve her presence. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he ever could. Claire Daniels wasn't the type to ignore her gut instincts. She had known Sophie for years, and as her best friend, she had a knack for spotting when something or someone didn't quite add up. So when Sophie began mentioning the man she'd been sharing breakfast with in the park, Claire's curiosity was piqued. "He's quiet," Sophie had said one evening while they were closing up the bakery. "Keeps to himself. But there's something about him, I don't know. I feel like he's carrying a lot. Claire had raised an eyebrow. And you've been sitting with him every morning? Sophie, you're too nice for your own good sometimes. You don't even know this guy. Sophie had brushed it off with a laugh. He's harmless. Besides, it's just breakfast. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The following morning, she decided to take a detour through the park on her way to work. Sure enough, she spotted Sophie sitting on their usual bench, chatting with a man in tattered clothes. He fit Sophie's description: unkempt hair, scuffed shoes, hunched posture, but something about him felt off. Later that day, Claire's suspicions were confirmed in the most unexpected way. She was passing by a high-end restaurant on her lunch break when she spotted him again. Only this time, he wasn't wearing his shabby park clothes. He was in a sleek suit, standing outside the restaurant with an air of authority that couldn't be ignored. He was talking to a sharply dressed man, his gestures confident, his posture straight. Claire stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. There was no mistaking it. It was him. The same man Sophie had described as homeless was now looking every bit the part of someone who belonged in a world of luxury. She watched from a distance, piecing it together. The way he carried himself, the sharpness in his gaze, it was all wrong for someone living on the streets. Whoever this man was, he wasn't who he appeared to be in the park. That evening, Claire confronted Sophie. "You need to be careful," she warned. "That guy you've been meeting? I saw him today, dressed to the nines and looking like he runs the whole city." Sophie frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that he's lying to you," Claire said firmly. "I don't know who he is, but I'm going to find out." Ethan sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the untouched glass of water on the table in front of him. The air felt heavy, the silence pressing against his thoughts. Every morning with Sophie had been a reprieve, a small glimpse of a world he hadn't known he was missing. But now, the weight of his deception was crushing him. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, his mind replaying the warning he'd received earlier that day. Claire, Sophie's best friend. She'd seen him. She hadn't said anything, but the sharp look in her eyes had spoken volumes. The jig was up, at least for her. It was only a matter of time before Sophie found out, and the thought made his stomach twist in knots. Ethan rose from the couch and began pacing the room. He had never felt this trapped before. Every decision in his life had been calculated, every move deliberate. But this was chaos. His disguise, his carefully constructed persona, it had started as a way to understand her, to see the world through her eyes. Now it felt like a ticking time bomb. He grabbed his phone, staring at Sophie's number. He had never used it. He didn't even know why he'd saved it that day, when she'd written it on a napkin for a friend of hers at the bakery. She had no idea he even had it, and the thought of calling her felt like crossing a line he couldn't uncross. But wasn't that the line he was already dancing on every day? His thumb hovered over the screen. He could tell her everything. Right now. But then what? Would she ever forgive him for lying? For pretending to be someone he wasn't? Would she look at him with the same warmth, the same trust? Ethan put the phone down with a frustrated sigh. He couldn't risk it. Not yet. He needed more time. Time to figure out how to tell her. Time to prove that his feelings were real, that he wasn't just playing some elaborate game. He sat back down, his mind racing. What would she think if she knew he'd been helping her behind the scenes? The rent reduction for her apartment building, the anonymous donation to cover her father's medical bills, even the art supplies delivered to the community center, all of it had been his doing. He thought it was a way to ease her burdens without overstepping, but now he wondered if it would only make things worse. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. He had never felt this out of control. His empire, his fortune, his reputation, none of it meant anything in this moment. All he could think about was Sophie and the inevitable fallout when the truth came out. A knock at the door startled him out of his thoughts. He froze, his heart pounding. No one ever came here. This place was his sanctuary, away from the polished world he inhabited. He stood, hesitating before opening the door. It wasn't Sophie, it was Claire. Her arms were crossed, her expression sharp. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, stepping past him into the apartment. Ethan closed the door, his mind scrambling for an explanation. Claire, Save it, she interrupted. I know who you are, and I know what you're doing. He stared at her, the walls he'd carefully built around himself crumbling. It's not what you think, isn't it? She challenged. You're playing games with Sophie, pretending to be homeless while you, what? Study her? Test her? Ethan's jaw tightened. It's not like that. I never meant to hurt her. But you will, Claire said bluntly. She trusts you. She thinks you're one of the few people who understand her world. What do you think will happen when she finds out you've been lying to her every single day? Ethan looked away, his chest tightening. I didn't plan for this to happen, he admitted. At first, I just wanted to understand her. She's different. She sees the world in a way I never could. And now? Claire pressed. Now I don't know, Ethan confessed, his voice breaking. I care about her, Claire, more than I've ever cared about anyone, but I don't know how to fix this. Claire's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. Then start by being honest, because if she finds out from me or anyone else, it's over. You'll lose her. Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had to tell Sophie the truth, no matter how much it terrified him. It was the only way forward. And if he lost her in the process, then at least he would know he'd done the right thing. It was late afternoon when Sophie closed up the bakery, wiping her hands on her flour-dusted apron. The day had been busy, and she was looking forward to the quiet of the park, a moment of peace before heading home to her family. As she locked the door, she spotted Claire waiting on the curb, arms crossed and a serious expression etched on her face. Hey, Sophie greeted, surprised. What are you doing here? Everything okay? Claire hesitated, a rare moment of uncertainty flashing in her eyes. We need to talk, now. Sophie frowned, sensing the urgency in her friend's tone. What's wrong? Claire glanced around, ensuring they weren't overheard, before pulling Sophie aside. It's about that guy you've been meeting in the park, the one you've been sharing breakfast with. Sophie's expression softened, a small smile creeping onto her face. James? What about him? That's not his name, Claire said firmly, her voice cutting through the quiet of the street. Sophie blinked, confused. What are you talking about? Claire took a deep breath as if bracing herself. His name is Ethan Carter. He's not homeless, Sophie. He's a millionaire. The Ethan Carter. He owns the Sinclair Group, the fancy restaurant chain. Sophie stared at her, the words not quite registering. What? That doesn't make any sense. He's not like that. I saw him, Claire insisted, dressed in a suit, looking like he belonged in one of those skyscrapers downtown. I did some digging. He's one of the richest men in the city. Sophie shook her head, stepping back as if the words physically struck her. No, that's not possible. He's been lying to you, Sophie, Claire interrupted, her voice softening now. I don't know why he's doing it, but he's not who he says he is. You need to be careful. Sophie's heart raced, her mind spinning. The image of Ethan, sitting on the park bench, accepting her breakfast, listening to her stories, it all felt suddenly distant, like a foggy memory distorted by doubt. You're wrong, Sophie said, though her voice wavered. He's not like that. Claire reached out, her hand resting on Sophie's arm. I'm sorry, Soph, I had to tell you. You deserve the truth. Sophie stood frozen, the weight of Claire's revelation crashing over her. The man she thought she knew was a stranger, a liar. And now, everything felt like a lie. Sophie didn't wait until the next morning to confront him. Her heart pounded as she walked through the park, her thoughts swirling with disbelief, anger, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the benches, and there he was, Ethan, or James, or whoever he really was, sitting on the bench, hunched forward as if lost in thought. She stopped a few feet away, trying to steady her breathing. The sight of him, so familiar yet suddenly so alien, sent a fresh wave of hurt through her chest. Ethan, she called, her voice sharp and trembling at once. He looked up, startled. The use of his real name hit him like a blow. His first instinct was to speak, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't the warm, smiling Sophie he knew. Her gaze was hard, guarded, and filled with questions. I know who you are, Sophie said, stepping closer. Claire told me everything. You've been lying to me this whole time. Ethan stood slowly, his hands raised slightly as if trying to calm a storm. Sophie, please. Let me explain. Explain? She said, her voice breaking. Explain what? That you're not some struggling man trying to get by, but a millionaire playing dress up? That every morning we spent together was just a game to you? It wasn't a game, Ethan said quickly, his voice thick with regret. It was never a game, Sophie. Then what was it? She demanded, her arms crossing over her chest. What could possibly make you think it was okay to lie to me? To sit there, day after day, letting me think you were someone else? Ethan took a step toward her, his hands dropping to his sides. At first, I didn't know what I was doing, he admitted. I saw you in the park, helping people, giving what little you had, and I was drawn to you. You were so kind, so real. I wanted to understand your world, to see it through your eyes. So you lied, she said bitterly. Instead of just talking to me, you lied, every single day. Ethan's chest tightened, her words cutting deeper than he thought possible. I know, he said, his voice almost a whisper. I made a mistake. But Sophie, I wasn't pretending about how I feel. Every moment we shared was real to me. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? How stupid I feel thinking I could trust you, thinking I was helping someone who needed it? You did help me, Ethan said, his voice breaking. More than you know. You made me see things differently, made me question everything about my life. That wasn't a lie. Sophie shook her head, stepping back. I don't even know who you are. The man on that bench? Or the millionaire who watches from his office? I can't tell where the real you begins and the lies end. Ethan reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Please, Sophie, he said, desperation in his tone. Give me a chance to make this right. I'll do whatever it takes. She stared at him for a long moment, her emotions a storm raging inside her. Finally, she spoke, her voice cold but firm. You've already done enough, Ethan. Just stay away from me. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone, the weight of his choices crushing him as he watched her disappear into the distance. Ethan sat alone on the park bench, the chill of the evening seeping into his bones. The space Sophie had once filled with warmth and laughter now felt impossibly empty. Her words echoed in his mind, each one striking him with the force of a truth he could no longer deny. He had hurt her. He had betrayed her trust. And now he had lost her. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of his guilt pressing down like a crushing tide. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. When he first sat on this bench, pretending to be someone else, it was out of curiosity, a desire to understand her world. But it had become so much more than that. Sophie had shown him kindness, compassion, and a genuine connection that he hadn't felt in years. He hadn't realized how much he needed her until it was too late. For the first time in years, Ethan felt powerless. His wealth, his influence, his carefully controlled life, they meant nothing here. All that mattered was Sophie, and she was gone. But he couldn't let it end like this. Not without trying, not without telling her the truth she deserved to hear. The next morning, Ethan returned to the park. He wasn't in disguise anymore. He wore a simple button-up shirt and jeans, no longer hiding behind tattered clothes or false pretenses. He waited on the bench, holding a small brown paper bag, the kind Sophie always carried. When Sophie appeared on the path, her eyes met his, filled with hurt and uncertainty. Ethan stood, his heart pounding. Sophie, please, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I know I've lied to you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but you deserve the truth, and if you'll let me, I want to show you who I really am. He held out the bag, a humble offering. It's your favorite, a cheese roll. I want to start over, no lies, just me. Ethan returned to the park every morning, but this time, there was no disguise. Gone were the tattered hoodie and scuffed sneakers. He now came dressed simply, in casual button-up shirts and jeans, his polished image replaced by an authenticity he was still learning to embrace. He no longer sought to hide who he was. His presence was a statement, one that said he was willing to face the consequences of his choices. The first few days were the hardest. Sophie avoided him entirely, her usual route through the park conspicuously altered to avoid their usual bench. Ethan couldn't blame her. He had betrayed her trust in the most profound way, and earning it back would be a long, uphill climb. But he wasn't giving up. Not this time. Instead of waiting idly on the bench, Ethan began to act. He spent his mornings walking the park, talking to the people Sophie had shown him were so often overlooked. He brought hot coffee to Mr. Allen, the elderly man she greeted every day. He organized small trash cleanups with the joggers and dog walkers who frequented the area. He even struck up a conversation with the groundskeeper, offering to sponsor a new flower bed for the park, a gesture that felt fitting given how much this place had come to mean to him. But Ethan's efforts didn't stop at the park. Inspired by Sophie's quiet generosity, he took his commitment a step further. Through his company, he launched a community outreach program focused on aiding the underserved. The initiative included funding for homeless shelters, free art classes at local community centers, and job training programs for those looking to rebuild their lives. He worked tirelessly, pouring his time and resources into creating tangible change. It wasn't about earning Sophie's forgiveness. It was about living the lessons she had unknowingly taught him. One morning, as Ethan handed out bagels and coffee to a group of delivery cyclists near the park, he spotted Sophie walking along the path. His breath caught, but he didn't approach her. Instead, he simply nodded in acknowledgement, giving her the space she deserved. Sophie paused, watching him from a distance. She noticed how he interacted with the cyclists, his demeanor humble, his actions sincere. He wasn't the man she'd first met on the bench, nor was he the polished millionaire she'd learned about from Claire. He was something in between, someone who seemed to be trying, in his own way, to bridge the gap between two worlds. The next morning, Ethan was back at the bench, sipping a cup of coffee as the park slowly came to life. To his surprise, Sophie approached. Her expression was guarded, but she didn't walk past him this time. "You're still here," she said, her tone unreadable. Ethan stood, his heart pounding. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere." She crossed her arms, studying him. "You're doing all this? Why? To impress me?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I hope it shows you that I've changed, but this isn't just about you. It's about what you showed me, about what matters. I spent so much of my life focused on the wrong things, money, success, control. But you reminded me what it means to care, to really see people." Sophie's gaze softened slightly, though she didn't let her guard down completely. "And you think a few projects will make up for lying to me?" "No," Ethan said honestly. "I don't expect it to, but I'm not just doing this to make up for the past. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, because it's what you would do." Sophie blinked, her defenses wavering. "What if I don't forgive you?" she asked quietly. Ethan smiled faintly, his voice steady. "Then I'll keep trying. Not to convince you, but because I want to be the kind of person who's worthy of your forgiveness." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the park filling the space between them. Finally, Sophie sighed, her shoulders relaxing just a little. "You've got a long way to go." "I know," Ethan said, "but I'm willing to take the journey, no matter how long it takes." Sophie hesitated, then gestured toward the bench. "I guess I can sit for a little while." Ethan's heart swelled as she sat down beside him, the first real step toward rebuilding what he had broken. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. And for the first time, he felt hope that he might earn her trust again, one day at a time. Over the following weeks, Sophie began to notice a difference. Not just in Ethan, but in the world around him. The man she once saw as a deceiver now seemed genuinely determined to undo the damage he had caused. It wasn't in grand gestures or elaborate apologies, but in the steady, consistent actions he took to prove he was more than his mistakes. Each morning, Sophie would see him in the park, no longer sitting passively on the bench, but actively engaging with the community. He greeted Mr. Allen by name, often bringing the older man a hot cup of tea and a breakfast roll. He carried trash bags, picking up litter without a word, quietly cleaning the park he now seemed to care for deeply. Once, she even saw him helping a young boy fix the chain on his bicycle, crouched on the pavement with grease-stained hands, his face alight with the same warmth she'd seen when he used to sit beside her. At first, Sophie avoided direct interaction with him. She wasn't ready, not yet. The hurt of his deception still lingered, but her anger was beginning to wane. Watching Ethan from a distance, she couldn't deny the sincerity in his actions. He wasn't just trying to win her back. He was changing, bit by bit, in ways that felt honest and real. The community projects he started also caught her attention. The free art classes at the local center had doubled in size, now fully funded by an anonymous benefactor. Sophie had her suspicions, of course, but when she confronted the program director, they confirmed what she already knew. "It's Ethan, isn't it?" she asked, crossing her arms. The director nodded with a small smile. "He insisted on keeping his name out of it, but yes, and he's not just funding it, he's involved. He's been here almost every week, helping set up and even joining in on the painting sessions." Sophie couldn't help but picture him there, sleeves rolled up, trying to navigate a canvas with the same focus he used to fix that boy's bike. It made her smile, despite herself. One afternoon, as Sophie walked through the park on her way home, she saw Ethan again. This time, he was standing near a newly planted flower bed, speaking with a group of volunteers. He didn't notice her at first, too engrossed in the conversation, but when he finally looked up and met her gaze, his expression softened. Sophie paused, debating whether to approach. Part of her still wanted to hold on to the walls she'd built around herself, but another part, a quieter, growing part, felt ready to take a step forward. She walked over, her heart beating a little faster with each step. Ethan straightened, his posture a mix of hope and hesitation. "You've been busy," she said, her tone lighter than he expected. "I have," he admitted, a cautious smile forming, "trying to keep my hands clean, or dirty, depending on the work." Sophie chuckled despite herself. "I've noticed. It's different, seeing you like this." Ethan nodded, his eyes searching hers. "I'm trying, Sophie, not just for you, but for me, because I don't want to be the person I was before." For a moment, Sophie said nothing. Then finally she smiled, just a small one, but genuine. "You're getting there," she said softly. "Keep going." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan with the faintest glimmer of hope that forgiveness wasn't as far away as he once feared. The sun shone brightly over the park as Sophie arrived at the community center, her messenger bag slung across her shoulder and her steps lighter than they'd been in weeks. Inside, the once dull space buzzed with activity. Children sat around tables covered in paints and brushes, their laughter and chatter filling the air. At the far end of the room, Ethan stood, sleeves rolled up, his hands smudged with streaks of green and blue as he attempted to help a boy mix colors for his painting. Sophie paused in the doorway, watching him. He looked different now, not in appearance, but in demeanor. There was an openness about him, a willingness to be part of something bigger than himself. She smiled faintly as the boy pointed out a mistake Ethan had made, and Ethan laughed, raising his hands in mock surrender. "You're hopeless at this," Sophie teased as she walked over, startling him. He looked up, surprised but pleased to see her. "Guilty," he admitted, wiping his hands on a rag, "but I'm learning, slowly." "Looks like you're doing more damage than good," she quipped, gesturing to the streak of paint on his cheek. Ethan chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Occupational hazard, I guess, but I'm glad you're here." She nodded, setting her bag down on a nearby table. "I figured it was time I joined in. This was my project before it was yours, remember?" "Always was," he said softly, meeting her eyes. "I'm just borrowing it." The two of them began working side by side, setting up materials, helping the children, and making small talk with the volunteers. It felt surprisingly natural, as though the tension that had once lingered between them had softened into something else. Sophie found herself laughing at Ethan's awkward attempts to draw a flower, and he, in turn, admired the ease with which she encouraged the children to embrace their creativity. Later, during a break, they sat on a bench outside the center, sharing a bottle of water. The laughter and voices from inside drifted out, blending with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "You've really changed this place," Sophie said, glancing at him. "The kids, the programs, it's all grown so much." "I just gave it a little push," Ethan replied. "The heart of it was always here. I just didn't see it until you showed me." Sophie looked down at her hands, her fingers toying with the cap of the water bottle. "I wasn't sure I could forgive you," she admitted, her voice quiet. "What you did, it hurt. A lot." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on her. "I know, and I don't think I can ever fully make up for it. But I'm trying, Sophie. Every day I'm trying to be better, not just for you, but because I want to be. You've shown me what that looks like." She met his eyes, searching for the sincerity she doubted before. Now she found it, raw and unguarded. "You've come a long way," she said after a moment, "but trust isn't something you rebuild overnight." "I know," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm just asking for a chance to keep earning your trust, to keep showing you that I mean what I say." Sophie studied him, her mind turning over everything she'd seen in the past few weeks. The projects he'd started, the time he'd spent helping others, the humility he'd shown, it all spoke louder than any words ever could. "Okay," she said finally, her lips curving into a small tentative smile. "But don't make me regret this." Ethan exhaled, relief washing over his face. "I won't," he promised. "You've got my word." They sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of the past slowly lifting. Inside the center, a child called Sophie's name, and she stood, brushing off her skirt. "Come on," she said, extending a hand to him. "These kids need all the help they can get." Ethan took her hand, standing beside her. "Then let's not keep them waiting." As they walked back inside, side by side, Sophie felt a sense of hope she hadn't expected. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt that they could rebuild, not just their trust, but something stronger and more real than before, together. It was a crisp autumn morning. The park bathed in a golden glow as sunlight filtered through the amber and crimson leaves. Sophie walked along the familiar path, her breath forming soft clouds in the cool air. She wasn't sure why Ethan had asked her to meet him so early. It wasn't unusual for them to see each other in the park, but there had been something different in his voice, a nervousness she hadn't heard before. When she reached the bench, the one where they had first met, she found him waiting. He stood as she approached, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm despite the crisp air. "Morning," Sophie replied, eyeing him curiously. "What's this about? You sounded serious." Ethan chuckled softly, stepping aside to gesture toward the bench. "I thought we'd sit for a bit. It's been a while since we've just talked here." She raised an eyebrow but nodded, taking a seat. The bench was as familiar as ever, the wood worn smooth by time and weather. Ethan sat beside her, leaving a small but comfortable space between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the park filled the silence, the distant chatter of joggers, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds. Finally, Ethan broke the quiet. "You know," he began, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "When I first sat on this bench, I had no idea what I was doing. I was pretending to be someone I wasn't, trying to understand a world I didn't belong to. But then you came along." Sophie tilted her head, studying him. There was a depth to his voice, an honesty that made her heart tighten. "You shared your breakfast with me," he continued, his voice softening. "Not because you had to, but because that's who you are. You didn't ask for anything, didn't expect anything. You just gave, and that moment changed everything for me." She looked down, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Ethan, you don't have to. Let me finish," he said gently, turning to face her. "Every step I've taken since that morning has been because of you. You showed me what it means to care, to really see people, and you showed me what it means to love." Her breath caught as his words sank in. Before she could respond, Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. The sight of it made her heart skip a beat. He knelt down in front of her, the box held carefully in his hands. "Sophie," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've taught me what really matters, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm worthy of your trust, your kindness, and your love." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring, its design timeless and understated. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. For a moment, Sophie was speechless. The man kneeling before her was so far from the one she'd met all those months ago. Gone was the facade, the deception. What she saw now was the real Ethan, vulnerable, genuine, and wholly devoted. Her eyes filled with tears as she smiled. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Of course, yes." Ethan's face broke into a radiant smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger. He rose to his feet, pulling her into a warm embrace. Sophie wrapped her arms around him, the chill of the morning forgotten as they held each other. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie laughed through her tears. "You really know how to make a moment, don't you?" Ethan grinned, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. I had good inspiration. They sat back on the bench, their hands entwined, watching as the park came to life around them. The bench, once a symbol of deception, had now become the place where their story truly began. A story built on trust, forgiveness, and love. And as they sat together planning their future, Sophie realized that sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations. This story reminds us that kindness has the power to transform lives, even in the most unexpected ways. It shows that true change begins when we choose to confront our mistakes and take responsibility for our actions. Forgiveness is not about forgetting the past, but about building trust and understanding in the present. And above all, it's a testament to how love, when rooted in honesty and compassion, can bridge even the widest of divides. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales that remind us of the power of kindness and love. What would you do if you were in Sophie's shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective.